So, dear all, thank you for being here today at this biodiversity seminar held by the WSL Biodiversity Center. And today we have the pleasure to host Gianmaria Bonari from the University of Siena. He is now senior researcher at the Department of Life Science of the University of Siena, starting in October 23. He is a vegetation ecologist by formation, and his research revolves around plants, involving a throughout understanding of natural and semi-natural plant communities and habitats at different spatial scales. His training, academic training, includes ecoinformatics, vegetation classification, management, and conservation. He's interested also in vegetation databases, in classification, protected areas, plant invasion ecology, macroecology, and biological conservation, especially in relation to pine forests. He is also part of the editorial board of Biodiversity and Conservation and Applied Vegetation Science. He is also member of the steering committee for the Italian Society for Vegetation Science and the International Association for Vegetation Science. Also, he is a member of the European Vegetation Archive and the ESPLOT, that is the Global Vegetation Database. So, his talk today will foresee an overview of his studies on Mediterranean pine forests. And after 45 minutes of talk, we can have questions from the stage. And of course, he's invited by the GIS group, which I am working in. That is a group into the unit Forest Resources and Management here at the WSL. So, Gianmaria, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you to your group and to WSL for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me. And today I will have an overview on pine forest of the Mediterranean, which I guess it's somehow a new topic for you, but still hope it will be interesting. So the presentation outline briefly foresees an introduction of Mediterranean basin, why to study pine forest, what are these Mediterranean pine forests, a bit of previous studies on Mediterranean pine forest. I will talk more in detail about this specific vegetation database, which is called CircumMed database. I will then mention something about the ecology and the classification of these forests and some conservation application and why to use such data. Then I will present you some more other study cases and some ongoing studies. So Mediterranean, at least for me, it's a very interesting study area. I've been working in the Mediterranean since my PhD, and as Blondel cited in 2010, it can be considered a sea surrounded by mountains. And this means that the environmental heterogeneity we have there, it's incredible. It's incredible in various terms, in terms of diversity, biological diversity, but also in soils, in environmental gradients, and so on. So it's really a nice, steady area. The Mediterranean basin can be considered splitted in two halves, the Western Mediterranean and the East Mediterranean. There are only few authors that actually consider or recognize Central Mediterranean, while most of them prefer to split it in two halves. And as you can see here, it includes 3 continents, 24 countries, depending on the classification, but most importantly, it has 2 very large gradients in both latitudinal and longitudinal extent. And it also includes almost 15,000 kilometers of coastlines. So there are also a lot of islands. The climate is definitely hot, especially if you look at the panel C here, you can observe the fact that temperature can reach up to 30, 35 degrees, and there is a gradient from north to south. And the same applies also to precipitation, where you have, where you have a gradient from north to south in reducing precipitation. So when we look at the forecast in terms of climate change with respect to Mediterranean, in comparison with the world trend, we see that the changes are even steeper for what concern the Mediterranean. So it is a black line compared to the green one. So this, of course, adds reasons why we should focus on this area. It's also an interesting study area because it hosts many species. And if we look at this plant species area relationship, we can see that as other Mediterranean climate regions throughout the world, there is a comparable number of species there, which is still lower than neotropical forests. As I said, even though there are different Mediterranean climatic areas throughout the world, we will focus this presentation on the Mediterranean basin only, where currently are considered present around 25 native plant species, and the endemic ratio is about 50%. There are endemism rates higher in other regions, but still it's not that low. And when we focus on the rate of endemism, it's clear that many of these centers are in the main islands of the basin, such as Sicily, Crete, Corsica, and so on. But not only, also mountains serve as area of endemism. When we focus on the number of taxa with particular respect to the woody species, we can have a look here in the panel A. We have the distribution of biogeographical provinces and the native taxa in each of these biogeographical provinces. And we see that when looking at the linear regression, there are areas that host more species, more native tree species than expected. And one of these regions is the Apennine Balkan region, as well as the Italo-Tyrrhenian region. But also, this applies for endemic taxa, still woody. So, after this brief introduction, let's dip into the pine forest, where I present you this nice scheme that I modified from a paper of 1996, taken from Corsica, if I'm not wrong, where we basically see that there are two clear patterns of pinus forest in the Mediterranean. A group of mountain pine forests, including Silvestris, Eldraichi, Nigra, and Peuce, and a group of, let's say, worm love species, and therefore forests, including Brucia, Pinaster, Pinea, and Alepensis. So with respect to the vegetation stages, we can roughly distinguish these two big groups of pine-dominated forests. In general, pines of the Mediterranean are occurring in both acidic and limestone bedrocks. But one common characteristic is the fact that all of them occur on oligotrophic soil environments, on shallow, typically shallow soils. The one that can be considered a bit more acidophilous is Pinus pinaster. Somehow this distinction of montane and non-montane pine forests is reflected in the species phylogeny, where we can see that the subgenus Pinus and subgenus Pinaster are divided by the number of vascular bundles, and they are grouped together. So Alepensis, Brutia, Pinaster, and Pina, which we said they are those of the Thermo-Mediterranean and Meso-Mediterranean belt, so those worm-loving, while the mountain species are somehow grouped together with the exception of the Eldraki. This is an interesting study which showed the fact that when they analyzed the chloroplast DNA variation in Pinus pinea, they found basically no variation throughout all the Mediterranean basin, which means that somebody happened. And the most reliable option for this is the fact that Romans spread the species in former times. So the variation of this species is very low. And keep this in mind because it will explain something else later in the presentation. When it comes to classification, it's natural to work with habitats. And or this is what usually vegetation ecologists and vegetation scientists do. They work with habitat, either Natura 2000 habitats from the 92-93 EEC directive or EUNIS habitat, the other classification of habitat, but with no legal effects. So here we see the distribution of habitat 2270, which includes Mediterranean pine forest on sandy soils. And that's why they are distributed along most of the coasts of the basin. And here it's a focus, a more detailed focus with the, let's say, a recent habitat report from the Italian Society for Vegetation Science that shows basically that most of the Italian peninsula host Mediterranean pine forest along the coast. So those at low elevation, typically close to the sea, you might have visited during your vacation perhaps, right? And these forests are old established forests, which means that in many cases became nowadays, I don't know how to call it, either old established or close to natural forests. So if you look in the understory, it's hardly at many sites recognizable whether it's a plantation or not, but there will be time for discussing this later. This is instead is the distribution in Italy of the habitat, the parallel one, still with Mediterranean pine forest, but not occurring on sandy soils, but on rocks. And you see that even though the dominant species of the forest is the same, the distribution is pretty different. So how I ended up in studying pine forests. I was working within this site, which is 6 kilometers isthmus in southern Tuscany. And basically what you can see here is an old established plantation. So this piece of land was completely reforested during the last century. And there is a nice dune system here that is well preserved. So we got interested in this because typically there is this perception of ecologists that plantations are always somehow a threat to biodiversity or or something to be avoided with respect to conservation. And therefore, they were quite neglected in terms of studies. So there was basically nobody interested in this pine forest. So we wanted to really to understand this ecosystem and understand whether these were true biological desert or not. So a couple of years ago, we made a study where we compare, of course, we didn't have the data, so the past data. So we built up a comparison system of protected areas nearby with the similar environmental characteristics here. So this is our reference site with 3 other comparison site with 3 different levels of disturbance to understand which is nowadays the state of this site after 100 years after the reforestation. And what we found is the fact that our restored site is the most similar to the best protected areas nearby, which means that after some times, the degree of naturalness gets back to some extent. Not only, we were also interested in the fact that when you work with the environment, and you do as well, and you modify the species composition, you make plantation, or you make some form of management within your system, you definitely change your species composition of your habitats. But what is more neglected is the fact about what's happening in the communities in the below ground part. And here we look whether there is a concordance between the vascular plant and the mites communities. And what we found is the fact that there is a concordance, which means that as the vascular plants have the specific ecology in the overstory in your forest, the same happens in the below ground part. So your, in this case, animal communities similarly respond in your system, okay? And this is something I think should be taken into account because we tend to overlook this part when we manage our ecosystems. Then we wanted to understand why and if the species composition of this forest dominated by different pines with the specific reference to Pinus halepensis, Pinus spina, and Pinus spinaster were similar. And what we found is the fact that when you consider the understory in your analysis, everything gets together. But in reality, when you remove the effect of your understory, the understory shows clear patterns. And these patterns can be basically summarized in these 2 graphs. I start from the one on the right, where you have the distance from the coastline from 0 to 6,000 meters, so 6 kilometers, and the probability of occurrence of the 2 species of our analysis. The Pinus spinaster was removed because we had few sites. But basically what we see here is the opposite response of the 2 pines. But what is actually instead happening in the understory with the herbs is that a gradient from the sea to the inland is maintained, which means again that I remember you that we are talking about systems that have been managed and planted in the past, or at least favored. So it means that biodiversity in some years is able to restore and to maintain the ecology of the species. So here, for example, we have a group of species occurring, sorry, it's okay. So we have this group of species that love to occur close to the sea, while when you move inner, you have typical species of the forest, okay? So this is also something to take into account because we tend to consider forest, but we overlook often biodiversity in the understory. again, we realized the fact that these forests were not, or we thought, and we want to test whether these forests were really different. And in fact, when you differentiate the forest dominated by Pinus spina and the forest dominated by Pinus halepensis, it turns out to be different, okay, even if they are included in the same habitat. With reference to management, instead, we wanted to test whether there is an effect of the fencing. So which is the role of fencing in our target habitat, which is, again, this old established plantation. Again, using both vascular plants and mites. And what we found is, here are our, just to give you a taste of how the two systems, so this is fenced and non-fenced, how they look like. And we found an effect of fencing, which at small scales improve and increase the biotic heterogeneity and increases beta diversity for both plants and mites. Okay, but let's go to the core of this presentation, where I want to talk about a study where we classified the pine forest of Mediterranean and sub-Mediterranean pine forest at the European scale. Basically, there was a formal request to EVA, which is the European Vegetation Archive. Some of you might know it. It's the biggest European database of vegetation plots. There are several custodians, so it works as a framework, and you can request the data. So our aim was to obtain a classification of this forest. But, because there is a but, when we request this data, we realized that many data were missing. So there was the need of creating something better and specific, so that we started a compilation of all vegetation data throughout Europe and actually North Africa concerning pine forest. We digitized this data and we made it in an electronic format. And this compilation of data now has the name of CircumMed Forest Database, because in the time includes also other forest types, not only pines. So the original name is CircumMed Pine Forest Database, but now it became CircumMed Forest Database, which I think it's quite interesting for you, even though I imagine you have your focus on Switzerland, but maybe not only. So here it's an overview with the red points of all the available data in the first stage of this electronic database of vegetation. So all these points represent, all this red point, well, actually also the blue one, represent a vegetation plot. So for those who are not familiar with, a vegetation plot includes all the species within a quadrat with abundances of all species there. So it's an enhanced form of the species occurrence. So you have the relative presence of species there. So here is just a small overview. Most of the data contained there pertain Turkey and Italy, and there were some authors quite active from Morocco, Algeria, and Turkey. And so we have said that the database was formalized in 2018 with slightly more than 6,000 vegetation plots. Nowadays, this database increased to more than 12,000 vegetation plots, and this is the current distribution. Okay, so in 2020, with a large group of vegetation scientists led by Milan Chitri from the Masaryk University of Brno, after many years of work, especially by him, it was released this compilation of European habitat, known as EUNIS habitat. You might have heard about it. And in particular, pine forests are included under this code, T3A, Mediterranean lowland to submontane pine forest. And this is the distribution of the habitat. So vegetation scientists are often not, I don't want to say happy, but they want to go deeper into the classification of habitats. Therefore, we are not always happy with the definition of pine forest. So we want to get into this, and therefore we create further categories. It's a bit complicated system, but it's really worthy, especially for those working in ecology. Okay, so this is the data set we work with. It included, it included more than 10,000 vegetation plots. And here it's an overview of the different types of this forest. And the workflow, it's kind of long and complicated, but basically what we did is we merged the available data, then we classified these plots, and then we resampled this plot, and then we tried to create an expert system. So this expert system means that there is a script based on statistically derived combination of co-occurrences of species that you basically create, and it's then able to classify your plots automatically for newly retrieved data. And then after this, we were able to derive indicator species, maps, and altitudinal density graphs for different group of pine forests. This is a brief overview of a dendrogram, of twist-span dendrogram, which shows how the analysis basically worked. So with mainly Pinus brutia forest dominated with his respective types, then Pinus alepensis types, and so on. And here is the map of these types, which have complicated names for those who are not familiar with phytosociological names. But if you consider them with ecological respect, they are pretty much meaningful. And for each of those groups, there are indicator species that can tell you exactly that you are within that group. So once you have these groups, you are able to distinguish your pine forest in more specific way. And different colors here, which are orange, green, pink, and red, refer to the dominance. Yeah? So Pinus alepensis, brutia, pinea, and pinaster. I don't enter in too much in the detail because I know the audience, it's from different backgrounds. So I'm happy with this main message, but if you are more interested, I can tell you more. And as I said, each of these groups refer to a specific ecology, in this case, elevation. So some of them overlap, but some of them are instead complementary. So they shift in their elevation occurrence. And the same applies to the climatic features of these forests. And here you see the groups, how they are distinguished along the first and second axis and first and third axis. Always colors refer to the dominance of forest. But what is perhaps even more interesting is the fact that once you solve and you analyze numerically this huge amount of data that in the past were described only on the base of experience. This kind of new techniques allows you to have robust analysis, statistically meaningful, and they can be then they can solve these classification schemes and then can be used to apply this new or revised system to the main system of vegetation of Europe, which includes all the vegetation types of Europe. So if you don't know this reference, I think it's quite useful. So in synthesis, what this paper allowed to describe a new type, because there is a hierarchy in this classification, and the highest level of this hierarchy is represented by vegetation classes. And basically what we did is that we divided pine forest from oak forest, because in the previous classification were included all under this name, which is Quercetia ilicis, and it doesn't matter, it's too specific perhaps, but we created this new big box to include all the Mediterranean pine forest under Pinetae alipensis. So, as I said, we make this comprehensive assessment of this pine forest throughout a large gradient, and this classification scheme will allow to very much improve the conservation policies. We all know that we don't have money to conserve everything, but with such detailed classification, we can prioritize vegetation types, and in this case, pine forests that are of interest, because maybe they are rare, they include endemic species, or are more subjected to different treats, and so on. This is another study case that we did in Turkey, because when we were preparing these databases, we were traveling around the Mediterranean, and here you have the two pictures of this forest. Yeah? So this is a Pinus pinea forest, pure Pinus pinea forest in Turkey, and this is a pure Pinus brutia forest in Turkey. And we are referring to this study area, so the Mediterranean Turkey. Okay. When you look at the distribution of these two species, which have quite relatively similar ecology, you realize that there is a very much different in the distribution of these species in that area. You see here, Pinus brutia is basically everywhere in the Mediterranean Turkey, while Pinus pinea it's rather scattered. So we were interested in understanding why these forests are not have a difference between the fundamental and generalized niches. Here are the grid maps, and again, in more detail, you see the different distribution of two species that dominate forests, but with similar ecology. And what we found is that when it comes to the climatic features, many of them are similar. So there is actually not much difference in climatic variables that can explain this non-homogeneity of the distribution. And also, when you see the niche of the two species, they are overlapping. So there was something more to explain these differences. And it turned out that what explains the differences between these two dominant pine forest species is the calcium content and soil pH. In fact, all the sites hosting Pinus pinea forest are acidic, okay? While the ecology of Pinus brutia is much broader. And this also explains why Pinus pinea occurs so nicely along the sandy coasts of the Mediterranean, because the sandy coasts of the Mediterranean are acidic. So we can speculate about the spreading of these species in the past by Romans, and probably they found that the species cope well with these acidic soils, and perhaps they started planting. Who knows? One of the last examples of published studies deals with forests in terms of regaining areas. Okay, here is the trend of the total forest area for the Mediterranean, and if we look at the natural trend here, this line here, you see that is growing. But what makes this increasing pattern existing? So we used as a study case the Sardinia here, where the three species occur: Pinus pinea forest, again Pinus alepensis, and Pinus pinaster forest, with actually very little distribution. So this is Pinus pinaster only occurring here. This is Pinus pinea only here, and this is Pinus alepensis. So they are not very much widespread, but they work exemplarily for what we were interested. Well, first we actually published again the classification of this forest, because nobody did it before, so we needed first to understand what was there in terms of biodiversity, and then we look at the pattern of regaining space from this forest, and here you see a site from 1954, 1977, 1998, and 1999, and you see that all the gained forest area are actually represented this by this forest, and in particular this was Pinus pinaster. But when we look at the pattern of these three forest types, we see that actually only alepensis and pinaster grow quite a lot, while Pinus pinea not much. So again, this is a speculation about the fact that probably it was brought there in the past, and it's not really widespread because of this reason, and cannot regain. But we know that there are also problems of germination and so on. So it's a more complicated picture, but this is the knowledge so far. So in the last 10 minutes, I will briefly show you what we are doing now. So this was what we did in this year, and what's next. So I make a step back to the classification of EUNIS European habitats, where also mountain pine forests are included, because so far I've shown you all the study cases of, let's say, lowland pine forest. Now we focus our future studies on mountain pine forest. And mountain pine forests are basically included in these two habitats, T36, temperate and sub-Mediterranean montane Pinus sylvestris and Pinus nigra forest, and Mediterranean montane Pinus sylvestris and Pinus nigra forest, which, as you see here, have these two distribution. Then there is another habitat which includes also plantations, not only of pines. It's a bit broader habitats because it includes other conifer species, but just as a reference where it's distributed in Europe. We are running actually two projects on this, on the mountain pine forest. One is classification, so what has been done for let's say, thermo and meso-Mediterranean pine forest will be repeated for Pinus nigra, but also we are interested in plantations, because they are quite much neglected in in literature, at least for what respect the biodiversity part. Here I put for your reference the distribution of Pinus nigra in Europe. So different colors refer to different subspecies, but it's not of our interest, just to show you the gradient of how much is distributed this species. So what we are doing here is to assess the differences between native sites and non-native sites in terms of plant diversity. So here in blue, you have all the sites where Pinus nigra is native. And in red, you have the sites where Pinus nigra is instead planted. This paper is under review, but I can anticipate what we found, and is that alpha diversity is basically, alpha taxonomic diversity is basically the same between planted and non-planted Pinus nigra forests, while functional diversity is slightly different. And when it comes to beta diversity, instead, it seems that both taxonomic and functional diversity are pretty much similar in both planted and native forests. Then I go back 1 second to the classification of habitats, because in these years, the group of the Masaryk University also produced these nicely prepared maps of alliances, which is another category of this habitat classification, let's say. And there are still some unresolved issues to be improved, okay? But we have seen that Pinus nigra and Pinus sylvestris occur in the same habitat, okay? So what we might investigate is which is the role of the dominance of these trees in your forest. What is the role of your canopy? So here are just some preliminary analysis that shows that even though the habitat is currently within one box, it actually has quite different distribution. So there is, I think, room for improving also the classification of habitats, because when we analyze such data, we see clear differences in these forests, also with reference to biogeography origin of this forest. Okay, I conclude with a couple of slides more, saying that, of course, when you work with the macroecological scale, these data are great, but when you reduce your scale, there is, of course, always there is always room for improving. So we realized that actually, here you see the map of natural and non-natural Pinus nigra forests in Italy. So the red ones are those native available data. But we knew that there are some relict sites here in Central Apennines. So last year, we went there sampling, actually climbing, yeah, because now I understood why nobody sampled before, because they are quite unreachable sites. So we try to fill the gaps in terms of distribution and knowledge of biodiversity of these forests, because I have seen here you have great data sets of basically everything, forest structure, species distribution, everything. But in Italy, we have a lot of work to do. Yeah, the country is quite long, and yeah, so we are doing this work as well. And when we look at the patterns of this Pinus nigra forest in Italy, that, as I said, include also all the established plantation, you can find patterns of species richness that, for example, decreases with increasing elevation, or, for example, species richness that increase with increasing latitude. So I finished. I think, yes, I stay in time. I thank you for your attention and I'm available for questions. Yes.
So I haven't done any vegetation classification, but I understand why you focus on trees because they're the obvious big dominant thing in a forest. And I always wonder, once you've classified by trees, is there a sub-classification based on other types of organisms, even just the other vascular plants that are there? You showed a PCA where it seemed like the understory was quite similar. So maybe this doesn't make any sense, but maybe there's levels of classification, especially if you were interested in conserving the diversity of X forest that you would want to consider. And so how do you do that?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and thank you for this. If you want to know my personal perspective, the new approach, is to revise the full vegetation type. So because in the past, what was happening is the fact that each botanist or each vegetation ecologist was describing a community in his valley or in his region. Then what happened that similar communities was described the valley aside. So it happened that the same communities have been described several times. Now with the available data at such broad scale, you can make an overview that is definitive, and it's also statistically validated. So I hope in this new era, let's say, of vegetation classification, these new techniques allow to make a more stable, even though, like by definition, maybe classification cannot be stable, but definitely it's more robust. So my approach is to consider the whole vegetation type overall its distribution. In this case, the whole distribution of Pinus pinea, the whole distribution of Pinus nigra, and so on. This is I'm not sure if I answered, but.
But then which would you choose which to conserve, right? Would you then also consider beta diversity of the understory species so that you conserved?
Well, it's context dependent. I think it depends on the conservation agency. Depends on the local emergencies, for example. So such studies at the broad scale will serve more at the European level. So to help the European Environmental Agency, for example, to understand what is worthy conserve. I would personally focus on those types that are narrowly distributed, including some interesting species, but there is no one solution. I think we should evaluate case by case.
Thank you very much for these interesting insights into the Mediterranean pinus forest. I don't know if I get it completely right, but at the beginning you showed that the Mediterranean pine forests have a high endemism, a high rate of endemism. But later on you showed that if you plant these Mediterranean pine species on sites outside the natural range, you have the same biodiversity basically. Mm-hmm. So how can you explain that, or what is a specific case of where you did not find any differences?
Actually, the graph was showing the rate of endemism of 3 woody species, so not only of pines. Yeah, so it's like a compilation of Mediterranean woody species, like with other trees. So the rate of endemism include woody species, not only pines.
Yeah, that's clear. But later you showed, I don't know the pine species that you showed, but you compared natural sites where they occur naturally and outside the native range. And you found that the vegetation biodiversity, so which includes also other woody species, but also herb species, did not differ. And also the functional diversity, I could not see any difference. Okay, so I'm wondering how that can be. So, can you also...
Yeah, it's relatively surprising results because yes, like by literature or what every botanist or vegetation ecologist would expect, there is difference. However, as I said in the beginning, the degree of naturalness of these plantations probably increases with time. And because these forests are typically planted in harsh conditions, pioneer vegetation will go back relatively fast. And therefore, at many sites, you have the restoration of native vegetation, which doesn't mean that we have to promote plantation or we have to say, okay, let's plant everything. Yeah, because in many sites, this plantation ruin the valuable habitats. Yeah, so I'm not here saying that we should plant everywhere. This is not the key, the take-home message. For example, in some sites of the Vinschgau Valley in South Tyrol, they replace, Pinus nigra forest replace important habitats of dry grasslands. Yeah? But not only also in the Apennines. But when it comes to the data, what we found is such a similar, at least as macro pattern. Yeah? We have to be careful. We have to be careful, but I think here the message is that not always plantation make environmental troubles, especially if you do plantations with species of the same biogeographical region. So here we are not talking about planting eucalyptus from Australia. We are talking about native species that maybe have their distribution range 100 kilometers far away. So also in terms of climatic condition is not different, and therefore the native vegetation could restore. This is my interpretation.
But it could be also a chance then for conservation to use also plantations and conservation strategies.
Exactly, and this is what we try to convey in our conclusion of the paper, saying that perhaps, yeah, once you consider all these possible environmental issues, we might think to make plantation at proper sites, not damaging other valuable habitats, but maybe use them for timber instead of cutting virgin forests elsewhere in the world. It's a hot topic.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is super specific. You had an ordination of beta diversity, and I couldn't get my head around what you ordinated to get a beta diversity ordination looking like that.
Where is it? Where it was?
But maybe that's too specific.
This one.
Yeah. What is that? How is that made? Sorry.
Well, it's too specific. We can discuss it later,
Okay.
I think.
Sorry. I've never seen beta diversity depicted in that way.
Yeah.
I have a last question. How can be useful to the point of future planning, taking into account environmental changes, that could be climate change, for example, and the utility of these databases?
Yes, I think these vegetation databases represent a valuable tool for future because, as I said, if you look only at the dominant species, you might miss a big part of the picture. So including the part of the understory allows a much more detailed understanding of these ecosystems. And therefore, for example, when you model your data for some specific reasons and you produce climatic scenario for future, having this or account also for the species occurring at a particular site might add a quite valuable information. Because as I said, it's sometimes it's not enough to say that it's pine forest. We want to go deeper, and here it comes the strength, I think, of this data and the use for future. Yes.
Okay, a non-specific question. All right, so you did this for forest, pine forest, and now you're going to do it again for all of European forest. And you're basically refining the category that from the European classification. So now if somebody else came in and say did it for grasslands, or they did it for some other vegetation type, they might have a whole other set, or even if they use the same methods, they might have different cutoffs or like, and then, I mean, ideally you would somehow get all the experts to make the same decisions so that you had comparable subcategories. Is there a plan for this, or is this?
Yes, there are other people working on that, specialists for dune vegetation, specialists for riverine vegetation and so on, grasslands. And the idea here is also to include always regional experts. So for example, in this paper of pines, there were experts from Anatolia, experts from North Africa, experts from Iberia, so that they have to check whether this classification makes sense to them. Yeah. So it's not only putting the data in the machine and okay, this is the result. There is also a margin for interpretation. So it's on one hand, it's robust because it's statistically derived, but there are some adjustments that can be done if the whole story doesn't make full sense. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much. That was super interesting for someone like me who knows nothing about it. Thank you. I'm sure for those who know a lot more about it, and we appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. Bye.
So thank you, Gianmaria.